After Steve Rogers put an end to World War II, by multiplying the army of the cracked holeboy by 0, the American dollar became the first currency measure, which is why the US economy began to grow faster than grandmothers on battery dough, and the father of the best engineer in the history of the earth suddenly realized that it was a sin to have so much money in one. He opened the sieve circuit to shift budget dollars directly into his pocket with the help of muddy projects, because all that the sieve has done useful for 70 years is to warm up Rogers, buy him a set of punching bags, and he built a useless flying longboat, which is stormed by one archer at a time. And every day is called, Yar, for a day, tell me. And looking at how Howard Bezalable will fix things, it becomes interesting, how he has not yet been robbed to the last cowards, because when the scientist Hank Pym invented a Sieverodko, capable of reducing a person to the level of intelligence, the writers of the 9 Fast and Furious, Sieverodko, which he decided not to put on industrial production, fearing that he would fall into the hands of pyrorists, to Howard, I already had to try to copy it, because he didn't buy the patent for the technology that was funded by his company, and, probably, they decided that they were able to copy my developments. You also need to be that dilettante, to pour millions into a project that you will never be able to use. Also those Neanderthals to accept Hank's dismissal without question. I ask you to accept my resignation. What, officially? You're free. When in the harsh reality of big money, Hank would have been buried in the woods by this Genochu, and Sieverodko was synthesized at Stark's factories. Because no one would have scored on the project so easily, which you can tuck in the Oyakam USA runaway money. It's a crazy business. Everyone got through too. Past 2 decades, and the ant suit fulfills its main task, is used as a dust collector, and a Stallman with a corridor for moths and Taurations, but only one cool scientist, Darren Cross, fans of Hank's studies, will let down thousands of sleepless nights under a baseball, an armor of capuch droppers, forgetting their reduction technology, and he took fate by the hand, and when Sieverodko is about to cook, Hank's daughter accidentally warms her ears at the scenario radio, and finds out that Cross is going to use his Hydrum technology, who has long wanted to end serfdom on Earth. The family contractor decides that all the work of the Cross needs to be fucked up urgently. Well, since Hank has become too old for such work, and the reflex is no longer the same, he comes up with the most idiotic plan how to circumvent Cross. Wait until the super burglar bear catcher comes out, spend a lot of time to teach him how to steer properly in an ant suit, and send him to arrange a diversion at the Cross factory. And Pym, of course, did not think that Cross could already invent a sea lion that night, and in the morning, Gidrum will push her, and they will already be drinking their gin near the White House. Well, let's not talk about it. Therefore, it was necessary not to be stupid, but to let my daughter do all the work. I know every floor in the building. I know the logic of the Cross, and I am the best prepared of all those present. Is it logical? Yes. No. I found the performer. Experiment time. And here's the one Hank chose for the role. Bring serve I Dino. Mashai, a professional pile cat Lenk, who only once made his way into the machine organization, and returned money to people. Day was still drunk. I went to the bottle of justice, and I didn't have time to enjoy the air of freedom. How fate immediately puts a stick in his wheels. At first, he can't get a job from a criminal record. Also an ex with her new one. Does not allow to see with his daughter, and demands alimony. This kid was unlucky from birth. His life is at every turn to wallow, and the cattle have no choice but to engage in crime, and agrees to the offer of his Kurish Lewis, and rob an old man's house. Tell me what's next. So what? It turns out to be Hank, who threw vodka on his house, so that Scott went to rob him and found an ant costume there. After all, it's easy to contact him, to explain the situation to Kevin, to throw a genjot on Lappel, to introduce his daughter closer as too logical. It's better to complicate everything and come up with a plan and hope that Scott wants to rob his house, and then he also realizes that his life is too boring without an old leather suit. Don't you recognize it? Was he assaulted on the very surface? And anyway, the devil knows what Hunt has found for cattle, for which it will be an event to steal sausage from the fountain. At first, he begins to prepare tools for the evil safe, when all that is known about him is what my closet is so specific about. Come on, pros. I must admit, Scott doesn't even think about how he will crack the safe if it takes a face ID to open it, sing a song, Kirkorov, or pronounce a special curse, and also gets into the house without a mask, because they know the implementation of surveillance cameras, but the historian does not know the implementation of logical thinking. For when Scott's plan was to steal the suit, he didn't hide it in the cheapest safe, and in the one that Scott discovers, only thanks to his knowledge, the director's alchemy, in which mixing water with nitrogen gives an explosion of 10 kilograms of TNT. Himmel, you have to respect. And when no normal thief would pay attention to a costume for Halloween, Scott takes it for some kind of fuck, instead of searching the house for jewelry, and he was frozen again. But, further, The old one just began to sit in front of the monitor and wait for Scott to show interest in the suit, which he could generally put on in a month, or to understand that he was crying on the moon and would stretch out in my opinion. And about Ronnie in a couple of phrases. Hank immediately shuts up, and does not bring him up to speed, so that Scott does not do any stupid stuff. After all, having no idea how to use a suit, he could accidentally press the reset button to the quantum world, and Super Strotech Hank would lose the costume and performer. And Hank, of course, a cool scientist, has created a suit that spits on the laws of physics, because when he only has to reduce the distance between atoms, he manages to reduce the weight of the object as well, but somehow it transmits the kinetic mass of the weight of normal cattle, and not reduced. But Pym continues to behave rather strangely. Every time Scott comes back to normal, he only gives it away. Well, yes, before the connection. Cross at any moment can finish the chin. So I'm fresh with Scott in a week or two. So, there would have been a fight if Scott had not acted like a reasonable person, returned the suit back to the addressee, and then you never know who he robbed there. But the cops are waiting for him near the house, who decided that he was stirring up a bookmark in this area. And since 228 give at least 3, Scott still agrees to work for the elderly. She leaves the plot. The cattle are waiting for a cool transport, and when Scott did not reasonably fly them on the 6th, Hank immediately gets into the Fast and Furious and starts playing checkers, so that his only performer flew out of the saddle, fell under the wheels of a car, and he blew his suit, which practically happened. Blagamontagerka Beshevna. At the time, she caught herself and moved the cattle directly to the house of the elderly, who does not know what a reception is at all. Once, instead of a bottle of moonshine for acquaintance, she offers him a tinted water. Shall I pour you a cup of tea? In general, having accepted Scott into the ant ording, Hank takes him to the laboratory, where he tells him that once he washed off the keys to the Merkov Nitas, and he had to invent a shrinking suit to get them, and that the cattle will now have to get into the corporation, cross, and do everything possible there, so that the Hydra political party does not win the presidential election, lands with 100% result in voting. If you don't win the damn Hornet and destroy all the scientific data, Darren Cross will release monsters and wreak havoc. What's so dramatic? And the training program begins. The distribution of rights for you money in an ant suit. Keyhole forging. A physics technique having hand-to-hand combat in which a small Scot can use the power of a large cattle. As long as you say, all the power of your body will be concentrated in the blow of a microscopic fist. You're like a bullet. Courses on how to enlarge any object of your body to a size larger than average. And practice, etc. Ants, who Hank taught to be helicopter pilots and saboteurs, and even Score Colian, who Mui helps generate idiotic ideas. Yes, just reading a lot. But the plan of destruction, competing technologies, is as simple as the lyrics and songs of the Hands of the Upper Hand. Get inside the corporation of a bald man, knock off the suit itself and burn the servo with data. I hope that a cool scientist will not store this formula on 10 servers in different parts of the planet, and that he has 5 mansions do not store any more suits for Hornets. That's a good question. Well, while Hank was butchering cattle, Cross, after the tank, Igora, is refining the chin and can already reduce live objects independently. And when Hop told Hank about it, it turns out that it's time for him to retire long ago and watch the TV series PNTV. Ethan hadn't bothered to get an anti-jamming device for communication with Donnie Cross beforehand, and only now is sending cattle for its illegal withdrawal from the warehouses of the account. After all, he is sure that the part that was in Howard's warehouse 30 years ago is still there. The facility is still owned by Howard Stark. The police are at one of his abandoned warehouses. Well, then everything is just fine. I wouldn't rely on that. But the funny thing is that having hundreds of flying ants in Rami, well, I didn't even conduct a reconnaissance of the warehouse, which has now become the official inventory of the builders. Not expected, bam, and in the course of frequent reductions, the brain of cattle remained the size of an ant, did not fall asleep at first, to encircle the base of the builders, and when the future Captain America burned it, I can see you, and I can see you, in general, the police and called his name. Hello, I'm Cattle, handsome. In order to calculate his place of position tomorrow, I sent him to places that were not very far away, and there were times when Disney could afford the courage, and put a black guy just to the guards in the warehouse. IAAAA. Initial. Well, since it is already known that the Shield does not pay money to its employees, we have a very large loan, and therefore people are ready to help. But why be surprised? Why didn't Sokolt request reinforcements? After all, except for this individual, no one agreed to work for, thanks. Fuck the Podmobla. Although there is not much to pay him for, it is impossible to make one accurate shot, and when Scott would have used a day to find a jammer over there, Zacador horseradish HIV reduces this time to 1 second. After describing the suit in the Tash for a full inspection, Scott leaves, and the cool, responsible Stickle decides not to report the attack. Listen, I really don't want the captain to find out about this episode. Are you crazy? After all, not being a weakling who got into a fight is more important to him than the report on the fall of a man in a super technological suit, who may be an agent of Hydra, or, even worse than Russia. There is nothing like this in Russia. Well, yes, well, that's it, there is a jammer. Motivation is pouring out at least. Also, the cross itself appoints a day for the ice. I know, it's weird. Well, I want you to come tomorrow. I want you to see my M*K. And when he copied the hop with cattle, he immediately realizes that the Ant Orden will decide to pump into his deal with Hydra, and immediately prepares a counter-answer so that when the cattle get to the Hornet costume, Varugo was locked in a cell, although it was only necessary to call the brothers from Hydra so that they would not destroy the entire Ordine. This is how you need to be unimpressive in order not to know the exact plan of attack of the enemy, to allow them to almost crank it to the end. And since it's not a completely stupid cross, Chistikno increased the security of the building. The ventilation of the entrance to the building is reliably protected, and even taxable sensors are now. Vorden has to record chums with cattle, the characteristics of which, right special, fit the task of piracy. 2 hackers are fixing a laser grid to the entrance to the Hornets, and a professional plumber Lewis, who, the Hopu was building for the guards, should loosen the porvodes in the pipes so that the cattle got through them to the building. And after the cattle demonstrates to the homies that they can now fly in business class, not flesh and money, but pine, proceed to the operation under the code name. We shave the bald head. Hop installs an anti-jamming device in the server room and cuts down the cameras. The building passes by the IC, reduces the pipes to tear, and the cattle, like a conspiracy of Colomb on the flagship level, gets to the crane through which it gets inside the building. And then through the reverse mentalization, he orders the saboteurs' ants to take their positions, and arranges a short circuit to destroy the research data. Because when Baldy knew that Hunt would try to destroy the data, he did absolutely no protection for them. But for Hank's plan to work, this is the only data center where Cross stored data from his research. And since only idiots are spent on storage systems, Cross did not even put them in the workshops for the production of whey, where cattle set up a homemade Baba Hustry. Having got good, he falls into a trap. But in general, the plan is brilliant. True, pumping air from the flask or putting the cattle to sleep with an open. Cross certainly did not guess. Iskit gets out of the situation. Smash it against the flask with magnifiers, but again his brain does not have time to increase to normal size, because after seeing how Hank was shot, come on, to cope with his well-being, having forgotten to treat the soporific with a cross kick before that, which I would have sent first class to that color, if Hop hadn't poisoned the ants on him in time, which Ornish Mantishorovich conjured. And then the server froze from the cat at all, that he did not try to stop the cross with the suit, to the Hornets and rushes in pursuit. Only when the Hop manually rebooted the server, because she reassigned the task. Your job is to get a suit. Think fast. And since the bigger the car, the less dignity. Hank vacuums herself with her daughter on tanks, which in the course of every year carried out maintenance. Oskad collects the ants of the sun and goes on an attack on the cross, in order to demonstrate his pirate Pertsalanka again, because jumping into the helicopter, he did not knock out all the shit in a second, but began to jump like a blah in the balls. After that, he also dreamed of getting under the paw of a cross, and almost flew out without a ticket. And while the cattle were hanging out like a dirty rag overboard for those 3 seconds, a proven firm helps Cross to squeeze into a suit, and he hired a good designer for this. It's a pity that the guidance system was bought and given a view, which directs Ghana's laser anywhere, but at cattle. And why did the cross even have to shrink, in order to stalk the cattle about the old? And when the helicopter grabbed the death convulsions, they were evacuated to the rescue cell right into the basiling, where water with bleach got into the cross suit, corroded his brain, and for which he rushes at civilians, forgetting that live cattle are splashing in the water. What for? What for? And after a short bodily caresses, the cattle master throws the pass into an insect trap, and only when it remains to introduce the cross to the sole of the shoe, very timely, the cops appear, one of whom is frozen, and instead of just decreasing, the cattle being wanted, decides to poke with him, for which he receives a free electric carriage. Presnaki teenage, what a frenyeyu. Well, Cross, after a vigorous roasting with electricity, comes to his senses, and there is no way to complete the sale of technology to the Germans, pick up the Babosiki and dump the Sunset, suddenly starts bombing for a merged fight to an unknown type, and instead of jumping into a police car, and using a laser to warm up the skull of the cattle, takes his daughter hostage, for a new fight, forgetting that his guidance system, even the weather would not be able to fall, although weak intelligence prevented this time, because when the ex-boyfriend drove up to the house, and the cattle jumped out the window, Cross began to scratch his tongue, and did not turn enemies into pairs, and Momblastanal cattle started a fight in the room with his daughter to when the Cross started shooting randomly, accidentally turned it into a piece of charred meat, and the army of ants was torn off to the off-screen, used the dumbest way. While the ant was distracted by the Cross, the absolutely senseless cattle threw toys at him, when it was necessary to increase, and show how a person is a top Chitarakan, very top. And only after 4 minutes of fighting with toys, the cattle decides to try to get into the suit and break the electronics, having fulfilled the story. How did Henka find a way, not to be caught by the collector, and once inside the suit, both the titanium shell and the titanium shell are spilled, the cattle strangely does not decrease to an atom, but calmly breaks the electronics, and after, sending across to explore the expanses of the quantum world, after which the cattle samples in the quantum for no more than a minute, they are smart enough to use the magnification disc, to return to its standard size, which works successfully, and before that, Hank's wife could not think for 20 years, when cattle would be distinguished, and was a great scientist, and immediately after returning to the real world. Another inconsistency looms. Time in the quantum dimension is slower than the present, and when Scott returned from the quantum world in the final, 5 years had passed for him in just 5 hours. 5 hours for me. If the cattle were now in the Hoken world for 1 minute, then 6 days should have passed in reality. Jumping in time. P*******N. But then everything is clear for the cattle. He earned the respect of the X-Man, and got the go-ahead to date his daughter, picks up a good girl with a rich inheritance, and receives an invitation to an interview. I know someone. With Steve himself, the fucking strategist Rogers. Thank God. This time, at least my ass is not touched by this, Amsky horseradish. But, judging by the fact that the actors playing Gifts on the Cross, Corey Table is recorded by the actor in the third part of The Man of the Equation of Yasa, he did not die, but got into the quantum world, from where he will return to finally get enough. Well, Brashno, you buried me, I'm not dead.